Ukraine is reporting that Russia is massing forces outside of Sumy Oblast to open yet another front in the fighting. We're going to talk about that, plus Ukraine's red lines in negotiations with the Russians. And we're going to talk about, of course, the strange peace envoy appointment decisions and the U.S. decision to strike targets inside of Yemen. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all these stories in the world of national security. Okay, so one of the things I want to point out is that we sort of alluded to this yesterday, that Ukrainian officials are increasingly concerned about what they see as massed Russian ground forces in northern Sumy Oblast. And for those of you that are keeping score at home, Sumy Oblast is actually not far removed at all from the areas near here we go. Here is Sumy Oblast, where the Ukrainians withdrew from the Russian Kursk Oblast. And now I want to point out that, of course, Sumy is a fairly large oblast whose administrative borders run a fairly large stretch here all the way down towards Kharkiv. So this Russian forces could be massing just about anywhere. But again, if there's one thing we know about just simply good military strategy, it's that you never want to give your opponent a free pass. And if Ukrainian forces are currently fighting on the back foot, withdrawing from Kursk, well, the Russians are not going to simply allow them to cross the border and remain in place. Again, this would be something that the Russians would only do if, for example, they simply wanted Kursk back and had every intention of imposing a ceasefire. But again, Vladimir Putin has made it clear he wants to put Ukraine in the worst possible negotiating position. If Ukrainian forces are withdrawing, he's going to want to dig in and exploit that, continuing to push them into Sumy Oblast. So I'm extremely I find this extremely credible, both because the Ukrainians generally are good forecasters of Russian actions, and they're willing to publicly point out what Russian actions are, and that the Russians have just a tremendous incentive to do this. Now, what I find interesting, again, is that the White House continues to treat Vladimir Putin as though he is sincerely interested in a peace deal. Why you're going to further open up a front in a country? Remember, Putin's official stance in all of these negotiations is that he doesn't care about Kharkiv. He doesn't care about Sumy, right? He's there for the main four provinces. Now, what we want to point out as well, that's worth talking about, is according to at least one article, Ukraine has outlined its red lines for any kind of peace deal with Putin. And I think these are all things that Ukraine has been fairly consistent on. In fact, a lot of points that Ukraine has been consistent on, you see, don't appear on this list. But the most important is, one, that Ukraine is not going to withdraw from territory it currently occupies, or rather, it currently holds. It's not going to cede territory not occupied by Russia, but you may note that if Russia is currently on the offensive, taking more and more territory, this alone incentivizes Russia to delay and obfuscate any peace deal, because it's the only tool that Russia has to acquire all of the territory that it wants. Now, how much does it want? That's sort of no one knows that but Putin. And it's not even clear Putin knows what exactly he wants to see happen with Ukraine, right? The next point is, of course, the thousands of Ukrainian children that have been abducted by Russia. This has been a sore spot and a evidence of Russian war crimes, that Russia is adopting Ukrainian children in its territory. And this is in addition to being kind of monstrous at baseline, right? Why would you separate children from their parents and then forcibly adopt them into Russian homes? This is part of a deeper program in which they want to Russify Ukrainian children. They want to create the next generations of Ukrainians to not even identify as Ukrainians, to identify as Russian, right? This aligns with Putin's deeper objectives of kind of the Russification of Ukraine and his perception that loyalty to Russia and the Russian culture is simply superior, right? That Russian culture has a naturally dominant role in the Eurasian world. And this is super fraught. You may point out that this sort of idea that there's a superior culture who naturally dominates the inferior cultures surrounding it sounds a little fascist. And the answer is, yeah, it is. But this is standard right out of Alexander Dugin's playbook. And Dugin is unabashedly a fascist, despite claiming that Russia is the number one greatest anti-fascist in the world, which is because 80 years ago it fought the Nazis. It's great that they did that, but it doesn't mean that therefore nothing you say and do could ever be fascist again. Now, they also point out the Ukrainians want to figure out how to return the thousands of civilians who are effectively being held hostage by Russia in the occupied territories. And many of these civilians, for example, in places like Mariupol, have no loyalty and in fact are actively working against Russian forces. And this is sort of what they are obliquely implying to say, listen, some of these civilians are actually partisans who, if Ukraine was to cede that territory, those partisans would be subject to Russian law and Russian law enforcement, right? To the extent Russia can be said to have rule of law at all. It doesn't. It has the rule of vengeance and the rule of Putin mostly. And so the civilians who do not want to be a part of the new Russian state, as well as civilians who resisted Russian occupation, they need to have some kind of mechanism in place to return them. And I suspect that this is actually probably one of the least contentious points because, again, for Vladimir Putin, he doesn't want to have this cultural touchstone in his occupied regions where they consider themselves truly Ukrainian. Of course, the problem will be that many of these regions that Russia occupies have already been gutted of many of the pro-Ukrainian elements, both voluntarily, right? Pro-Ukrainian elements recognize that the Russian military was closing in and they retreated. They themselves fled to other areas. But there's also, of course, Putin is likely just simply trying to move Russians in and trying to elevate pro-Russian people. And there's been a decade-long campaign by Russia in the broader areas of eastern Ukraine, particularly the Donbas, to sort of Russify the population, right? They've had local governments, for example, that use Russian textbooks in their education system, that they speak only in Russian and do not cover the Ukrainian language. All of this kind of stuff contributes to, again, the Russification and the sense that Ukrainians are actually just, that are actually Russians, right? Which is, again, sort of a core point of this Putinist ideology. And of course, the one thing that Zelensky has repeatedly said is a guarantee of security should Putin infringe on any ceasefire deal, right? He needs to know, because of the negative experiences with Vladimir Putin abandoning both the Budapest Memorandum and 2 other Minsk peace accords, there needs to be a real meaningful international guarantee, not a maybe, not a, oh, well, it's implied, it's silently implied. A lot of things get silently implied, or it was totally implied that I said this or that. But in reality, it has to be credible, right? The credibility is everything. And if you are planning, for example, let's say the United States, if you are planning on not showing up in the event of Putin breaking the ceasefire, what would you do? Well, you would put anything that could hold you genuinely liable for failing to uphold an agreement. So you would make sure to never put it in writing that you're going to engage in a security guarantee. This is why the mineral deal is such a farce, because Trump officials have gone out to the media and said, well, the mineral deal is just as good as a security guarantee because the U.S. will, of course, always defend its companies extracting minerals from a region. This is blatantly not true. The U.S. military does not intervene to protect U.S. private interests around the globe. But more significant is the Ukrainians said, well, if that's true, if that is a security guarantee, then write it into the agreement. Say that. Say, in the event that there is any disruption to our mining operations, we will deploy the full weight of the U.S. military to secure it, right? Put those things in writing. And when someone goes, well, I don't want to put it in writing. Again, imagine if you went to a car dealer and the dealer said, yeah, I can give you this car, $15,000 cash up front. You said, great, write it up. And he goes, whoa, write it up. You go, yeah, write a contract that I sign and you sign that say we're going to charge this and that for the car. And the dealer goes, well, I'm not going to we don't need to put anything in writing. It's implied that the car is $15,000. And you go, what do you mean it's implied? If you're going to do it, then write it down. It's fine. Right. And this is so common, but it would be obvious to you that the car dealer is planning on pulling some kind of game, some kind of twist or turn that he's going to claim there was never any deal. You know this. It's transparently obvious. And again, the U.S. unwillingness to provide a security guarantee is transparently obvious by all of this, right? So all of these things are points that Ukraine has not really wavered on. Again, many of the other points that they've talked about, like the restoration of Crimea, et cetera, are simply have simply gone by the wayside, right? There's also talk about the grain deal, et cetera. So this is why I'm sort of, I view this with a lot of credibility. This is likely the very reasonable terms. And again, I want to point something out that Russia has nothing to worry about if they don't plan on incurring deeper into Ukraine once the international community has moved on from the Ukraine conflict, right? And that's probably what Putin's plan is, that or some kind of hybrid campaign to subvert Ukrainian democracy. All of these things are well within sort of the Putinist playbook, and they would explain Putin's reluctance to agree to any of these terms, right? Particularly around Ukrainian security, right? If Ukraine gives up those occupied regions, then there is by definition at least a buffer state, an additional buffer state between Russia and Ukraine. But you may notice, you may say, well, what if Russia considers those 4 occupied oblasts as part of Russian sovereign territory? Well, now you have kind of the self-licking ice cream cone that a lot of aggressor states tend to implement, which is to say that my borders have expanded. Right? They say, I have a security threat on my border. They expand their borders to push back that security threat. They say this is a necessary buffer, but then they annex that buffer zone. And they say, well, suddenly now there's enemies on my frontier yet again. And then they push that frontier further. This is exactly what happens in so many cases, right? From World War II Germany going into Poland and then saying, you know, guys, now that we've gone into Poland, we actually noticed there's another threat on our border in the form of Russia, right? And you also have it in other states too. So, you know, this is taken as a little bit of a sign, I think, again, that Putin should not be dealt with as anything other than a zero-sum game thinker, where he's going to come out on top or he's going to be defeated, and that's it, right? And unfortunately, there have been a lot of U.S. presidents that have really believed that there is some sort of, that if only they could just be friendlier with Russia, if only they could be friendly with Putin, they could really get him. He's just a teddy bear underneath. That idea that like we can just be a nice enough guy with him. If we just get a little friendlier, we can make some kind of deal happen. And it's never happened. He remains confrontational with the West. He remains to have designs on Western countries and the expansion of a Russian empire. And the only option in the face of someone like that is containment. It just is. Anyway, before we talk about, of course, Putin's ability to somehow dictate who the U.S. sends in part of their diplomatic packages, which is a power I didn't know was granted to Vladimir Putin, we are going to mention that there's been a lot of talk about the U.S. pivoting and having suddenly becoming an ally of Vladimir Putin. But just because the White House says something doesn't mean that Americans feel that way. And that's why I've partnered with UAO. They've launched their Double Down fundraiser. And this is supporting a whole host of units because they have a European donor who wants to remain anonymous, who has pledged to donate a 1-to-1. Every dollar that gets raised gets donated. He'll match. So it's a $500,000 fundraiser. But if we can collectively put up $250K, right, it's going to raise an insane amount of money. It'll be our largest single fundraiser, at least that I've been a part of. And it sends a message to the Ukrainians and frankly to the Russians that the United States, its people are our own entity, that we still, right, when you're a democracy, you don't just have the support of the government, you have the support of the people. And I think that's an important message. And it's going to benefit a ton of different units. But I think what is one of the most interesting is the Artan team from the Ukrainian GUR. This is the Ukrainian CIA equivalent. And this is some of their most secretive behind the lines units. We're getting them a very high end jammer, right, to allow them to operate in some of the most sketchy areas. And you can get, again, this is the equivalent of the CIA Special Activities Division. You can get these patches with a $250 or $400 donation of the Artan and the GRU unit, plus even more cool stuff. So you guys can go out there, support these Ukrainian units, get them the gear that they need, including the GRU, or the GUR. And of course, UAO is a US 501c3, so your donation in the US here is tax deductible. So check the link in the description. Okay, now I want to point out some things. Again, Putin is a power play guy. He wants to flex on people. And one of the ways he has flexed his power over Trump is forcing him to reassign Keith Kellogg as Ukraine envoy, right? Which you may note, it sounds like almost the same thing. But what's important is that Kellogg had been a chief negotiator. He had been a Ukraine-Russia conflict negotiator. He was a special envoy for both Ukraine and Russia. The idea, of course, you might recall, Keith Kellogg was the one who initially pitched a deeply flawed, but was seen as the architect of Trump's peace deal. And basically, Vladimir Putin said, I don't want this guy involved. And so if you want me to do this, you got to get rid of this dude. Now, you may think that someone who's serious about peace, why would he exclude the architect of the peace deal? And the answer is because this guy likely understands as a U.S. general. Now, Putin's official stance is that he's too close to Ukraine, which doesn't make any sense because his deal was actually pretty bad for Ukraine. And also, it's not clear on why he needs an anti-Ukraine person in that envoy, right? Vladimir Putin, again, this is so simple. Vladimir Putin, why, if you are sincere about peace, is this the move you would do? Would you sit there and go, I don't want this guy because he's too Ukrainian, too pro-Ukrainian, when I'm negotiating for peace with a U.S. delegation, right? That is, obviously, guys, it's not a secret. The United States gave massive amounts of aid to Ukraine. And the idea that one of these guys is too pro-Ukrainian, again, Vladimir Putin is here dictating terms to the U.S. president, telling him who he can and can't. What's next? Is he going to go to Marco Rubio and say, I know you're the congressionally confirmed Secretary of State, but I don't want you here. You need to get out. And then at what point do you sit there and go, well, okay, does Vladimir Putin have veto authority? Is this the position he's in? And what part of why Putin's doing this is to actually see it's boundary testing. It's just like an abuser. He's saying, how deep can I exert influence on the United States? How willing is this country and its leadership willing to cower in fear before me, right? And he's using that to try to discern the spine of the White House, right? And he's already seen in the previous conflict or the previous administration that the White House is sort of flimsy at best, right? When they're at their most willing to confront Russia, they still aren't really willing to risk an escalation. And so Putin is the one who always got to lead the escalation dance. He would, for example, invade via Kharkiv, opening up a new front in the war. And only then did the U.S. say, well, okay, we're going to deploy cluster munitions, right? And that's when Russian drones, for example, began to strike Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Only then did the U.S. go, well, we're going to allow these HIMARS. And only when the Russian forces massed directly on the border, right within meters of the Ukrainian positions, daring them to strike, did the U.S. finally lift its policy and say, actually, we're going to allow U.S. weapons to be used against Russian forces. So Putin already was testing these boundaries and likely found the U.S. pretty spineless, right? And that's why he was willing to sit there and knock on the North Koreans' door and say, listen, the Americans, you may think this is an escalation, bringing in an entire third-party country, expanding the war to include another combatant, but he goes, the U.S. is spineless, don't worry about it. And he was right. The North Koreans faced zero discernible consequences for entering a war against U.S. interests, right? Nothing happened to them. And the Russians, there was no additional sanction, no deployment of additional military forces, nothing from them going to a third country and expanding the war into their country. Or rather, expanding the war into their military. So already Putin goes, the U.S.'s most confrontational version of itself is already willing to just let me do whatever I want with absolutely symbolic consequences, or in the case of the North Koreans, no consequences at all. Now he's saying, can I actually dictate? Can I just force the president to just shuffle through envoys until I find someone they like? Can I just fuck with them? Right? Because remember, yesterday we talked about how Steve Witkoff was forced to wait around with his thumb up his ass while Vladimir Putin just fed him into a bunch of low-level representatives, right? What kind of message that sent about how serious he is for peace? The answer is he's not that serious at all. He just wants to flex. He wants to see what the U.S. is willing to do. And likely this is why he's structuring all of these meetings in the first place. He's saying, listen, I just want to find out what the U.S. is willing to give up here, right? Because once I do that, I know where I can push and where I can pull. I want to see the U.S.'s commitment to certain stances. And then I'm going to return. I'm going to pretend like I got offended over something. I'm going to resume the war on my own terms. Likely with a better sense of what the U.S. is willing to let me get away with. Because Putin has 4 years of this administration. He absolutely is. They're not going to harden their stance, right? They know they're already unbelievably, almost comically soft. So the fact that he's now literally just telling Trump who he can and can't appoint to his cabinet is pretty fucking insane, right? And I'm shocked that almost no one in the liberal media or in the conservative media is willing to say this, that this isn't an authority Vladimir Putin has. And it's unclear if he's serious for peace, he's going to take the team that sits across the table from him, right? It's not like if Keith Kellogg is too pro-Ukrainian, if he has a position that's too pro-Ukrainian, Vladimir Putin will just say, this position I have a problem with. Do you think the U.S. liked the North Korean or North Vietnamese representatives when they sat down at peace accords to end Vietnam? No, they didn't like a fucking one of them. Did you think the United States or even Trump liked the delegation that the Taliban sent? Do you think they refused to meet with certain Taliban officials in the first term? No, they almost certainly took whoever the Taliban sent. But why then is Putin able to dictate these terms, to say, I don't like this guy, I don't like this guy, I don't like this guy, I don't like this guy? What's the problem with this? Where's the strength? Where's the courage? Where's the spine from Mr. Strongman, right? It's like Putin, right? Putin, the reason the Russians tolerate him, they tolerate the lack of freedom, they tolerate the lack of free speech, they tolerate the critics getting murdered in gulags and pushed out of windows, because Vladimir Putin will keep them safe in a scary world. But if Vladimir Putin is unable to keep them safe in a scary world, then what in God's name are they still supporting him for? And of course, the answer is not getting pushed out a window. But at some point, the Russian government can't push 100,000, 200,000, a million people out a window. So it's a real fear, and it's a real problem for anyone who leads a country on the promise that their strength will keep the country safe. Now, here's what I want to point out. One of the things that bothers me a lot about, and this isn't just Trump, this is about, again, persistent U.S. policy, is that when it comes to confronting an actual threat, which is why the U.S. military exists, right? The U.S. military doesn't exist to deter the Taliban. It doesn't exist to deter the Houthis. It exists to check other great powers, okay? That's it. Other strong, credible militaries. And the U.S. military, it seems to be cowering before the Russian military. And yet, it is willing to more than ever project this absolutely stupid level of strength against fucking Houthis in Yemen. And guys, the Houthis, I don't care what we do with them. And there is almost no meaningful difference, right? And between throwing airstrikes at them and not, right? If airstrikes worked, the Houthis would have been eliminated during the Biden administration. Remember when they kept striking U.S. ships? And you notice here that I think that Trump says to Iran, support for Houthi terrorists must end immediately. Don't threaten the American people. The president, who has received one of the largest mandates in presidential history or worldwide shipping lanes. If you do, beware, because America will hold you fully accountable and we won't be nice about it. He says to all Houthis, your time is up. Your attacks must stop starting today. If they don't, there will be hell will rain down upon you like nothing you've ever seen before. Now, I want to point this out. First off, it's a little bit like a parent. You ever seen a parent get really mad when they know they can't really do anything? What do they start to do? They start to scream at the kid because they have no leverage left, right? You're screaming because you have no leverage left, right? Or like being stuck in traffic. When you're in traffic and you can't choose an alternate route and you can't go around it and you can't do anything else, the only thing left to do is scream. So when you see the president begin to scream or type in all caps, you know that he doesn't really have anything going for him. And to know this, look no further than Hamas. Remember, if Hamas didn't release all their hostages by Saturday a month ago, all hell would break loose. Hamas would be wiped off the map, right? Those were the president's exact words. In fact, I think we can even find the tweet or truth or whatever that he said about it, right? And if you zip back, we can probably find this, right? Let's see. Oh, of course, it's not going to let me. And boy, wow, Trump tweets absolutely prolifically. I wish I could find this, but literally a month ago is like 400 years ago by Trump standards. This is 5 days ago, and we literally have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tweets, or whatever the fuck these things are. This is, truths or whatever. And this is absolutely fucking insane. Screenshots of tweets, by the way, which is absolutely just brilliant shit. Damn, we can't even get, we're only a week ago. All right. This is insane. The president is literally insane. Hamas, threat, Trump, tweet, or whatever, truth. Yeah, so here we go. March 6th. So that was 10 days ago. Trump gave his last warning to Hamas to get the hostages back. He said, I'm sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member was safe if you don't do as I say, Trump said. Let's see if we can find the rest of it. Release all the hostages now, Trump said, or you will immediately return all the dead bodies of people you murdered, or it's over for you. For leadership now, it's time to leave Gaza while you still have a chance. And he then threatens the people of Gaza, which is just terrible. That's kind of fucked up, right? So he said, right? He said, one, in December, he said there would be hell to pay if the hostages were not released by the time Trump took office. Then he said, all hell will break loose if you don't release the hostages by Saturday after the 6th. And I want to point out, guys, that all hell was going to break loose on the 8th. And you may notice that Hamas, well, here we are on the 14th, and they're still thinking about releasing some hostages. Maybe they get around to it. Actually, they said that in fact, Hamas didn't even release the only American-Israeli hostage, and neither did they release any of the bodies of the Americans who died in captivity or who were killed. It's not clear. So, right, what I want to point out is that Trump's big threats, he doesn't really follow up on. And the problem is you can only get away with this kind of game for so long, right? And if you're not willing to threaten even a non-state terror organization, if you're not willing to actually step up and carry out your threats, then your threats subsequently become meaningless. So this thing against the Houthis, like, don't mess with us or else all hell will break loose. Again, he goes, listen, you're all hell breaking loose against Hamas didn't mean dick. So it's not going to mean dick to us, even though Trump claims that he launched a decisive and powerful wave of airstrikes against Houthi rebels. Again, this is absolutely zero difference from what President Biden did, right? In fact, President Biden, though, at least put out a press release that said, this is what we did. This is why we did it. Don't do this again. And obviously the Houthis were just like, this is also meaningless. This is also worthless. So, the U.S. president, again, always willing to use the U.S. military to uselessly pound impoverished third world terror groups, and completely unwilling to use the U.S. military to protect democracies or stand up to the globe's bullies. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Please hit that subscribe button. That makes a difference. Of course, a huge thank you to all our Colonel tier members, like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, Bastian Himmling, Brian Kelly, Del McComb, Steve Zoller, Henry Roos here, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Could not do it without you guys. Appreciate you all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.